Hi, so I'm going to talk about, basically I'm making this 4D game, I've been working on it for a while, and everything that you'd sort of take for granted in a video game, you have to think about how does that work in 4D, right? So there's a bunch of things, I'm going to talk about those. And then I'll show very quickly how I make levels. So this is what the game looks like, and I kind of want to, maybe you've already seen this video on YouTube or whatever, but I kind of want to show and explain the game again, just so that everybody's on the same page. So this is an example of something that you could do in 4D that you cannot do in 3D. So you have this wall, and you're trying to go on the other side of the wall, but you can't jump over it, you can't go around it. But what you can do is flip to the fourth dimension, walk along the fourth dimension, and then there's no wall, and you can just walk right past it. But let's go and explain that in sort of one lower dimension to see what happens. So you have this 2D character, and he wants to get on the other side of that wall, but he can't jump over it, and that's about all he can do. But actually, his world is three-dimensional, and he's just on a two-dimensional slice within that world. So he could just go around the wall in the third dimension, but how do you do that since he's just on one single plane? So you press a button and it turns your plane 90 degrees, so that now when he walks left and right, it means moving along the third dimension. And then you press the button again and you're like further along the third dimension, so there's no wall, there's just like rubble on the ground and stuff. So you can just walk right past the wall. Press the button again to get back to this sort of view where you can choose which world you're in, and then walk right back, and you're on the other side of the wall, right? So like, how does that work for him? Because he's just 2D, so he can only see a two-dimensional slice. So even though it feels like the world is all deforming and stuff, it's actually just that you're turning your slice. It's kind of like an MRI. So you just, sort of taking slices of this world. So here in the desert world, when he's in the desert world, he can't see the wall at all, right? So because he's like further along the third dimension, but he can kind of see the rubble. And then there's this sort of view where you see both worlds at once. Sort of desert, grass, and then you move between them and you go back. So now, okay, let's actually do this in 4 dimensions. So there's this character, and he is, in 3 dimensions. And when you press a button, you're sort of rotating so that you face along the 4th dimension now. So like this way now is the 4th dimension instead of what it used to be. So when you're walking that way, you're walking along the 4th dimension. And then you press the button again, and now you're in this desert world, which only has rubble, just like in the 2D case. So you can just walk right past the wall. So this kind of like same case, but like one higher dimension. Right, so this is where the wall was, right? So now you press the button again to get back to this view where you can sort of pick which world you're in, and you walk back to the world you started in, except now you're on the other side of the wall. Yeah, so that's kind of a brief introduction of the game. Okay, so how do we make this game? So first of all, if you're making a 2D game, your positions are stored using 2 numbers, x and y, and if you're making a 3D game, you also have a z component, and if you're making a 4D game, you have a w component, so 4 numbers instead of 2 or 3, right? That's pretty much the basic part. That's what it is. That's all it is, really. So size. So objects also have size. They collide with each other and stuff. And at the most basic level, like size is just like a range of positions. Like those are all the positions that this object that this object takes space from, right? So if you have a cube and the cube is like one corner is at 0, 0, 0 and the other cube is like at 1, 1, 1, and you want to see if a point is inside that cube or not, you can just go through every dimension like one at a time and just see if it's between 0 and 1. And if the point's position is between 0 and 1 for all 3 coordinates, then you're inside that cube. And in 4D, it's not much more complicated. You just have a 4th coordinate you need to check. And that's it. So the code for this is super simple. It's just a for loop for every dimension, and it's just check whether or not the point is in the interval of your box, right? And if it's true for all of those, then you're inside the box. If it's false for one, then it's not inside the box. And the cool thing about that is that it's just like this one number is like the number of dimensions. So like if you just set that number to 2, then you're saying, oh, is this point inside a square? If it's 3, is this point inside a cube? And if it's 4, is this point inside a hypercube or tesseract? So when I first noticed that programming, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I wonder what a 4-dimensional game would look like, right? And that's kind of what got me started making this game. So say you have your world and it's filled with 4-dimensional objects, but you still need to display what those 4-dimensional objects look like to the player, right? And in 3D, what we do normally is we just project down from 3D to 2D, right? Just like our eyes do. And so your coordinates go from 3 to 2. But in 4D, you could do the same thing where you sort of project down your whole 4-dimensional world to 2 dimensions. But the problem with that is that there's a lot of stuff in 4 dimensions. There's even more than 3, right? So it's all going to project and like overlap, and it's going to be really hard to see what is in front of what. So people usually solve that by just having objects just be like the outline of the object. So this is actually, this should be a full solid object, but we're just showing the lines or that it's made out of. And so it makes it so that it's less a problem when things overlap, but it's still kind of a problem. So there's another way that I chose to do it, which is slicing, which is inspired by this novella called Flatland, where it's you have a square and he lives in a 2-dimensional universe, a 2-dimensional plane within a 3-dimensional world, and he gets visited by a sphere, and the sphere, as it crosses the plane that this square is on, increases. It looks like a circle that increases in size and then shrinks. So like this, right? So the sphere crosses the plane and it looks larger and smaller, but you can have other shapes and it looks pretty weird. So it looks just like things are deforming, but it's just really movement. So yeah, this one has holes in it, so it's kind of cool. So how do we program this? So you have this 2D character, and he's standing on a 2-dimensional plane, and you have an object here. It's a cube, and you want to know what the intersection, like what does the player see, right? And so the way it works is. You go through every face of the cube, and you see what the intersection between that face and the plane is. So in this case, it's going to give you a line, or it's not going to give you anything if the plane doesn't cross the face. So like going through, so this face gives that line, this face gives that line, this face gives that line, this face doesn't give you anything, this face gives that line, this face doesn't give you anything. So you end up with these 4 lines. And what the player sees is all of these lines, right? So, but from his perspective, it just looks like 4 lines because he can't see inside the cube. But instead of doing faces of a cube, you could just think of just a regular triangle mesh, and so you just go through every triangle, and that gives you a line, and then all of the lines together are going to give you the shape that you can see. Yeah, and so for 4D objects, it's the same idea, but instead of triangles, it's tetrahedra. So the surface of a 3D object is 2D, so you can just make it out of triangles. And the surface of a 4D object is 3D, so you can make it out of tetrahedra. But it's kind of weird to say like, oh, the 3D surface of a four-dimensional object, like that's kind of hard to think about. So I'll give you some like intuition, or at least what I use to think about it. So if you have a 2D square, and it's it's basically you can make it out of taking this line and extruding it into the second dimension. And the boundary of it is going to be made out of 4 lines. And where do they come from? They come from like you had one line at first and one line at the end, and then each point at the boundary of the initial line segment is going to give you a line when it extrudes. And then for a cube, you can make a cube by taking a square and extruding it into the third dimension, and the boundary of it is a bunch of squares. So how many squares do you have? You have one square that you started with, one square that you ended up with, and then for each line segment that the first square was made of, you get, when you extrude it, you get another square. So you had 4 lines, they each made a square, that's 4 squares, plus the beginning one and the end one, and that's 6 squares, right? So now for the hypercube, you have a cube and you extrude it in the 4th dimension. So you have one cube initially and one cube at the end. And the boundary is going to be a bunch of cubes because it's a 3D boundary. So you have the initial one, the end one, and then each face that the initial cube had is going to make a cube when you extrude it. So you had like 6 initial squares, and they each make a cube, plus the beginning one and the end one, that's 8 cubes. So that's kind of the boundary of a hypercube, whatever that means, right? But it's kind of, right? It's kind of like you can see kind of where it comes from, kind of. So to get back to the 2D case, you had like those 6 squares, and they each gave you a line. And then the lines together make up a closed loop. And then for the hypercube, you have your 8 cubes, and each of them, when they get sliced, gives you like kind of this 2D shape. And then together, all these 2D shapes make up a closed surface, and that's what the game represents. And then I did this for like some crazy thing, like 4D crystals, where instead of starting with a hexagon and extruding it, you take a dodecahedron and extrude it, and that makes like this 4-dimensional crystal kind of shape, and that's what it looks like in game. They all are exactly the same shape, they just face different way. And yeah, during transition it looks pretty cool. All right, so texturing now. So now we know what the polygons are, but we still need to give them color and stuff. So texturing, the way we do this is just you take the 4-dimensional coordinates that you started from and just keep them instead of throwing them away when you render your 3D object. So you have the 4-dimensional coordinate that you started with, and you send those to your shaders, and at the end, you want to take those 4-dimensional coordinates and get some sort of color out of them. So there's this thing called Pearl and Noise, which generalizes to n dimensions, but it just kind of gives you these blobby black and white spots. So you just give it a coordinate, and it tells you how black or how white it is. And so I just call that on the coordinates. And for example, this big shape here, where there's moss and where there isn't moss, is defined by the Pearl and Noise. So it's like morphing as you take different slices, or like over here, like the little blobs and stuff. All right, so now, I'm gonna like make it a little bit more, something a little bit more complicated, I guess. So So it's like, yeah, so you have rotations, right, in a video game, and like the character might be on a 3D slice and he's turning your head, or there's a windmill that turns and stuff, and and there's objects that turn also. So, okay, that's the thing that I really like about thinking about this four-dimensional game, is that it forces you to understand things better than normal. So, and it also makes 3D simpler. So, you have this lady here, right, and that's a wheel spinning. But instead of traditionally thinking of like, oh, this is the axis that the wheel is spinning around, you just think of the plane itself. And so you can think, oh, a rotation is just taking this axis and turning it into this other axis, right? So going from X to Z, that's like one rotation. And that's really much better a way to think about rotation, because when you just say, oh, turn around Y, you don't really say like which direction you're going. You're just saying, oh, it's just the Y axis, whatever. And you have to define what that means. And also, in 2D, there's only one 2D plane. So why would you introduce a third axis just to define what a rotation is? So yeah, if you've done matrices and if you've programmed some graphics, some 3D graphics stuff, you just have like one matrix in 2D, and then if you want to do it in more dimensions, you kind of just take this matrix and put it where you need it. So this is like a Y to W rotation, so it's involving only the rows and columns of that correspond to Y and W. So the second and the fourth one. And then quaternions, which is totally this thing that people like to complain about. And they, I feel like rightly so, because it's totally like, why does I square equal J square or whatever equals -1? It's kind of like it comes out of nowhere and you don't really understand why it works that way. So there's this thing that sort of replaces that and works in n dimensions called a rotor. And the way it works is you kind of just want to know which planes of rotations you're working with. So in 2D, there's only one plane of rotation, that's the XY plane. And there's always like one more component on top of that. So in 2D, you have like one component for the plane plus one, that's two components, so that's just like complex numbers that you can use to represent rotations. And then quaternions, it's like, oh, there's three planes of rotations in 3D, so that's like 3 plus 1, that's 4 components. That's where it comes from, basically. And in 4D, it's just, well, now there's 6 planes, so that's like 7 components. So yeah, quaternions have like 7 components in my game, or 8 sometimes, which is pretty nuts, but you just kind of, you use them the same way as like regular quaternions. You try to not think about what they are, you just kind of use them, All right, so level design. Whoa, sorry. Okay, so level design is just, at the very core level, is just an array of blocks. So it just tells you, is there a block there or is there not a block there? So kind of like a 2D game, you have these tiles. Minecraft, you might have like tiles that are like three-dimensional, and you can think of Minecraft tiles as kind of like slices that are each two-dimensional, right? There's like the ground floor is like a grid of tiles, and then above that is another grid of tiles, and above that is another grid of tiles, right? So it's like thinking of three-dimensional space as a series of two-dimensional spaces, and this game does the same thing, except it's like thinking of four-dimensional spaces as a series of three-dimensional spaces stacked on top of each other, which kind of feel like parallel worlds. So here I have this level, and it's 5 by 4 by some height, but it's also, it has 3 parallel worlds, so it's 5 by 4 by 3 high by 3 worlds. And so in the second world, you just put some stuff over there. So there's the grass world, the desert world, and the snow world. And you just kind of go and place stuff in each world So it's actually like, it feels pretty straightforward, like it's just a bunch of parallel worlds. The hard part is how you move through them, kind of. It's like, oh, you have to stand in the right place to go from one place to another. But it's just a bunch of parallel worlds, that's all it is. So it's pretty straightforward to just kind of design levels that way. And you can have, pushable blocks and stuff. So yeah, so then each level really, the goal sort of making each level is to just create this situation where you have to do something cool, right? Like the wall one was a pretty straightforward level where it's just like two worlds and one of them has a wall and the other one doesn't have a wall, and that's it. And it's not really about like making complicated situations. It's just, oh, can I set up these things where you just have to do something cool in 4D. So they're almost not puzzles in that sense. The puzzle comes from the fact that you have to think in 4 dimensions to do it. But if 4 dimensions was trivial, it wouldn't be a puzzle at all. It would be, oh, I just go around this thing. That's like not a big deal, right? So like things like going around the wall or entering a closed building without opening any doors, or you have two rings and you can bind them without breaking them. Things like that. Yeah, so that's my talk.